If kicking Russia off SWIFT killed the dollar, we should already see the corpse in the data. Instead, what we see is something subtler and more dangerous: the global financial system quietly repricing its own plumbing. The easiest way to misread that headline is to picture global finance as one machine with one switch. In practice, it is layered. One layer is messaging, standardized instructions that let banks coordinate across borders. Another is clearing and settlement, the liquidity, netting, and legal finality that actually move claims and extinguish obligations. A third is custody and jurisdiction, where assets are held, which courts govern them, and what extraordinary powers can be exercised when policy turns hard. When headlines say SWIFT killed the dollar, they usually compress all three layers into one storyline. The analysis has to do the opposite: separate them, then watch how pressure applied to one layer transmits into the others. Start with messaging. SWIFT does not hold deposits or send money the way a commercial bank does. It provides secure, standardized messages that make cross-border transactions operational at scale. That sounds mundane until the network effect is quantified. In 2024, SWIFT handled about 13.4 billion messages for the year, roughly 53.3 million per business day, with about 11,800 live users connected to the network. Once a standard becomes that ubiquitous, exclusion is not symbolism. It is friction introduced into trade finance, correspondent banking workflows, and routine corporate payments. And because SWIFT is just messaging, the pain is often experienced as delays, higher compliance burden, more intermediaries, and more routing complexity costs that compound without looking like a single dramatic failure. But messaging is only the front end of the plumbing. A system can transmit perfect instructions and still fail if the back end cannot clear and settle claims at scale. This is where dollar power is frequently misunderstood. The dollar is not dominant merely because of habit. It is dominant because a deep ecosystem makes USD settlement the path of least resistance for high-value global flows, supported by market depth, intermediaries, and legal predictability. As one concrete proxy for that ecosystem, CHIPS reports processing on the order of $1.9 trillion per business day. Replacing that kind of settlement gravity is not just a software problem. It is a multi-year process of rebuilding liquidity pools, risk controls, and trust. The euro area's architecture reinforces the same point. Sophisticated systems do not run on a single rail. The euro system's T2 is described as processing payment values roughly equivalent to euro area GDP every 6 days. Global finance, in other words, already operates as a portfolio of infrastructures. In calm periods, participants choose rails for efficiency. In stressed periods, they pay for redundancy because single-point dependence becomes a strategic vulnerability. That is why reserve currency status cannot be declared dead or alive from one statistic. It is better treated as a scoreboard with 4 lenses that move at different speeds. The slowest lens is reserve composition, visible in aggregated form via the IMF's COFR dataset. Even there, shifts can reflect valuation effects when exchange rates move, not only active reallocation. A faster lens is payments activity, what currencies actually show up in cross-border payment flows. A deeper lens is market depth and liquidity, how easily large positions can be moved without destabilizing prices. And an operational lens is rail capacity and resilience, the scale and reliability of the networks that route and settle transactions. Seen through that scoreboard, the most defensible claim is not that the dollar died, but that the system began pricing an additional variable, the risk that access to key financial layers could become contingent on geopolitics. That risk does not need to trigger a sudden regime change to matter. It changes incentives quietly through contingency planning, diversification, and the slow construction of parallel pathways long before it shows up as a dramatic headline. History's recurring reminder is simple. When geopolitical stress rises, finance stops being treated as neutral plumbing and starts being treated as strategic terrain. The response is rarely a clean break. It is usually a gradual build-out of options designed to reduce single jurisdiction exposure without sacrificing functionality. So what actually happened in March 2022 was Russia removed from SWIFT, or was something more precise done with far broader implications? The answer sits in the legal switch that made neutrality feel conditional. The world didn't learn a lesson in 2022 because Russia suffered. It learned because the system proved on the record that access to financial infrastructure can be withdrawn, and sovereign assets can be immobilized by legal design. What happened in early March 2022 was not a cinematic unplugging of an entire country from global finance. It was a legal action with a narrow-looking technical description and wide systemic implications. European authorities prohibited the provision of specialized financial messaging services to a defined list of Russian banks, and SWIFT, as a service provider operating under European jurisdiction, implemented the restriction. The design choice matters. A targeted measure can still be systemic if it hits institutions that sit at the center of trade finance, correspondent banking relationships, and routine settlement workflows for large parts of an economy. The specificity is worth stating plainly because it is where the precedent hides. The list named major entities VTB, Bank Odkrytie, Novikombank, Promsvyazbank, Bank Rossiya, Sovcombank, and VEB. RF not because each was equally important to every cross-border payment, but because the designation created a template. It demonstrated that access to financial messaging can be converted into a permissions regime, updated by political decision, and enforced by compliance. For banks and corporates outside the blast radius, the immediate question was not, will this destroy Russia? But what does it mean that the system can be reconfigured this way, quickly and with clear legal authority? That question was not entirely new. A decade earlier, the same mechanism had been used against Iran. SWIFT disconnected sanctioned Iranian financial institutions under European measures, showing that messaging access could be weaponized as part of a broader sanctions architecture. The difference in 2022 was scale and signaling. Iran's case proved feasibility. Russia's case broadcast universality. If the system can be applied against a major economy with deep commodity linkages and extensive banking ties, then it could be applied to anyone. Stop sounding like rhetoric and start sounding like a scenario that risk committees must price. The second half of the lesson is not about messaging at all. It is about custody and durability. Once sovereign assets can be immobilized by the legal systems where they are held, reserves acquire a new attribute: jurisdictional conditionality. A freeze that is framed as emergency policy can be interpreted as temporary turbulence. A freeze that evolves into a long-lived legal condition is different. By late 2025, European policymakers moved to lock in the immobilization of a large stock of Russian central bank assets held in Europe, often discussed in the neighborhood of €210 billion, specifically to avoid the political fragility of repeated renewals. The operational message to the rest of the world was not a moral one. It was mechanical. Under certain geopolitical conditions, assets that look liquid on a balance sheet may be treated as legally inert for years. This is the point where targeted stops being reassuring. The targeted restriction in 2022 told banks that infrastructure access can be permissioned. The legal hardening in 2025 told reserve managers that custody can be contested and that the contest can last. Together, they created a new kind of risk premium, one that is not about default or inflation, but about political jurisdictional exposure. That premium does not force a dramatic, immediate flight from the legacy system. It encourages a quieter behavior. Build redundancy before you need it, diversify custody chains, diversify instruments, diversify settlement corridors. There is also a strategic paradox embedded here. Weaponization is often designed to maximize pressure while minimizing spillovers. Yet the act of proving capability can create spillovers that are psychological and institutional rather than purely economic. Even actors aligned with the sanctioning coalition have to ask whether the precedent narrows their own room for maneuver in future disputes. And actors outside the coalition have to ask whether reliance on a single jurisdiction's rules is still an acceptable baseline. The result is not a single coordinated exit. It is 1,000 incremental design choices, new clauses in contracts, new routing policies, new reserve guidelines, new contingency playbooks, each of which slightly reduces the monopoly-like leverage of any one choke point. The headline story focuses on punishment. The systemic story is about learning. Once the system demonstrates that it can withdraw access and immobilize assets by legal design, the rational response is to reduce single-point dependence, not because the legacy system stops working, but because its rules are now understood to be contingent, and contingency is the seed of alternatives. If the shock wasn't the headline but the precedent, how do we know the world actually changed its behavior? The clearest evidence sits in reserves, gold, and payment shares. A reserve currency doesn't die in a speech, it fades in spreadsheets. If weaponization is backfiring, the evidence will show up in how central banks allocate assets and how payments begin to route. The temptation after a shock is to treat the argument as settled by narrative. One side used the ultimate tool, the other side must now collapse, and the currency at the center must be finished. A serious read is less theatrical. It asks what the balance sheets are doing, what the settlement habits are doing, and which changes are slow structural drift versus fast-moving noise. That is why three signals matter more than 1,000 predictions: the composition of official reserves, the surge in insurance assets that sit outside sanction risk, and the currency mix appearing in actual cross-border payments. The first signal, official reserve composition, moves slowly by design. Central banks are not hedge funds. They prioritize liquidity, safety, and operational convenience, and they change their frameworks cautiously. That is why any claim that the dollar has been killed should be visible as a sharp break in the reserve share data. Instead, what the reserve data shows is continuity with gradual evolution. The dollar's share of disclosed global reserves sat around 57.8% at N2024 and about 57.7% in the first quarter of 2025, hardly the footprint of a sudden regime change. The more important analytical point is the warning label that comes with those numbers. Reserve shares can move because currencies move. When the dollar strengthens, the dollar slice of a portfolio can rise mechanically even if no one bought an additional treasury. When the dollar weakens, the opposite can happen. In other words, reserve shares are a slow-moving structural indicator, but quarter-to-quarter changes are not a clean referendum on trust. That guardrail does not blunt the story, it clarifies it. The backfire thesis does not require an immediate sell-off. It predicts something subtler, a long-term repricing of single-rail dependence. That is compatible with a world where the dollar remains the dominant reserve currency in the near term, while decision-makers quietly add redundancy, reduce concentration, and build optionality. If anything, the slow pace of reserve shifts is what makes the other two signals so important. They are where the system reveals its hedges first. The second signal is gold, and it is the cleanest observable form of insurance behavior. Gold does not depend on a foreign payment rail to be valuable, and it is not someone else's liability. When legal and custodial risk rises as a category, holding an asset that sits outside the usual enforcement channels becomes more attractive, even if it is less convenient than cash-like securities. In 2024, central banks purchased a net 1,045 tons of gold, continuing a multi-year run of annual buying above 1,000 tons. That does not mean gold is replacing the dollar in the way a reserve currency replaces another reserve currency. It means reserve managers are buying a hedge against a world where the definition of safe is no longer purely financial. The system is not abandoning liquidity. It is adding a layer of resilience. The third signal is the fastest moving one. What currencies show up in payment flows? Reserves are stock variables. Payments are flow variables. Stocks change slowly. Flows can change quickly, especially when firms are forced to redesign routing practices, when banks widen the menu of correspondent options, or when certain corridors begin to settle in different units. One widely watched proxy is Swift's RMB tracker, which reports the renminbi's share of global payments by value. In June 2025, it put the RMB at about 2.88% of global payments by value, and about 2.12% for international payments excluding intra-Eurozone activity. Those shares are not large enough to suggest a near-term replacement of the dollar's role, but they are large enough to matter as a directional signal. A non-dollar pathway can grow an activity share long before it becomes a dominant reserve asset. Interpreting this layer also demands discipline. A payment share increase can reflect temporary trade patterns, invoicing choices, or corridor-specific adoption rather than a wholesale reordering of the system. That is why payment shares are best treated as early warning indicators, not victory declarations. They show where experimentation has already become operational. They show which currencies are gaining traction in specific lanes. They reveal whether the outside options conversation is still theory or already becoming habit. Taken together, these three signals point to the same sober conclusion. The dollar remains structurally dominant in reserves, and the data does not support a dramatic, immediate death. At the same time, central banks are accumulating insurance assets at an unusually high pace, and payment flows show incremental diversification that can expand quickly in selected corridors. Backfire in this reading is not a cliff. It is the slow erosion of exclusivity, the move from a world where one system can credibly threaten universal exclusion to a world where more actors can root around pressure, accept higher friction, and still function. If the evidence points to optionality rather than collapse, the real question becomes, when do alternatives stop being hedges and start becoming credible outside options? That shift from signals to power mechanics is where the story turns. Sanctions feel like a nuclear option only when there's no bunker. The real turning point arrives when alternatives become credible enough that the threat still hurts but no longer dictates outcomes. By the time policymakers reach for maximum financial pressure, they are usually betting on a simple premise. Exclusion is decisive because the target has nowhere else to go. In a highly networked system, that premise can hold for longer than most people expect until it doesn't. The moment alternatives become credible is rarely announced. It appears first as routine operational work, new payment instructions, new correspondent paths, new settlement conventions, and contract language that quietly widens a firm's or a state's choices. That widening is the turning point, because financial coercion behaves like monopoly leverage. A monopoly is most powerful when outside options are absent. Its power shrinks when customers can switch, even if switching is inconvenient and more expensive. Credible alternatives do not have to replace the entire legacy system to matter. They only have to become functional in the corridors that are strategically important: commodity flows, critical imports, high-value industrial supply chains, or any trade relationship where a small number of counterparties repeat transactions at scale. Once even a portion of these flows can reroute, the threat of exclusion becomes less universal. The same sanction can still impose real pain, but it no longer guarantees a political outcome, because the target's survival function improves. Just as importantly, bystanders learn that survival is possible, and they begin building bunkers before they are targeted. That is why the architecture of alternatives matters more than the rhetoric around them. One observable example is the expansion of non-Western cross-border payment infrastructure that can support settlement and routing in parallel with legacy rails. China's cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, is often cited not because it single-handedly replaces SWIFT or the dollar ecosystem, but because it represents an expanding set of institutional connections that make certain non-dollar routes operational. As of December 2024, CIPS reported participants across 119 countries and regions, and described its business as covering more than 4,800 banks across 185 countries and regions. Those figures do not imply global dominance, they imply reach, and reach is what turns an alternative from a talking point into a usable option for specific lanes. Technology accelerates the credibility curve by compressing build time. In earlier eras, constructing parallel infrastructure required decades of institutional learning and balance sheet depth. Today, some parts of the problem, especially settlement coordination, can be tested faster. The BIS Innovation Hub's Project mBridge, reaching an MVP stage by mid-2024, is relevant precisely for this reason. It demonstrates that multiple jurisdictions can trial cross-border settlement logic that reduces reliance on a single pathway. That does not solve the hardest part of reserve currency dominance, which is deep liquidity and market trust. But it does expand the menu of options available for certain use cases, and in coercion dynamics, the existence of a menu changes behavior even when the best dish remains the old one. The real mechanism is not ideological, it is managerial. Treasury departments and central banks do not need to declare a break from the existing order to behave differently. They can do what risk management always does: diversify dependencies, reduce single points of failure, and pay for redundancy. And once enough actors do this, coercive leverage loses scale. Financial weapons are most effective when they arrive unexpectedly and when compliance choke points are tightly centralized. After a demonstration, the system's immune response is to decentralize exposure through routing options, custody diversification, and the deliberate creation of alternative rails that may be less efficient but more resilient under stress. This is where the twist becomes clearer. The biggest strategic winners are not always the architects of a new hegemon. They are often the intermediaries and hubs that can navigate multiple rails and extract better terms from everyone. Consider a neutral trade corridor that handles high-volume commodity flows. After 2022, it doesn't have to pick a side publicly to change its posture. It can rewrite settlement clauses to allow multiple currencies, expand relationships with alternative correspondent networks, and build a compliance stack that can flip routing rules when one channel becomes politically risky. Over time, that corridor gains bargaining power. It can demand discounts, fees, or strategic concessions because it offers something scarce optional access when others are constrained. Outside options also change the psychology of deterrence. A threat is deterrent when the targeted actor believes compliance is cheaper than resistance. Credible alternatives raise the expected payoff of resistance, not because alternatives are painless, but because they reduce the probability of catastrophic isolation. Once that probability drops, the sanctioning side faces a harder reality. To achieve the same strategic effect, it must either escalate further, rising costs and blowback, or accept lower returns. This is the essence of backfire as a power mechanic. The weapon remains available, but it becomes less decisive, and its repeated use can accelerate the build-out of the very options that weaken it. None of this implies a frictionless world. Alternative rails come with constraints: narrower liquidity, higher conversion costs, more intermediaries, and more complex compliance. Some corridors may be more vulnerable to operational disruption. Some alternatives may introduce new dependencies on a different set of regulations, technologies, or political relationships. But the logic of system change does not require perfection. It only requires that enough actors decide the trade-off is worth it. Higher friction in exchange for lower single jurisdiction exposure. When that calculation spreads, the world does not exit the legacy system, it adds parallelism. And parallelism is what turns a one-time nuclear option into one tool among many. Outside options come with a cost fragmentation, higher friction, and new dependencies. The real test is how that cost reshapes the effectiveness of financial pressure for everyone involved. The first time a weapon is used, it shocks. The second time, it's priced in. The third time, it's just another line item in contingency planning, and that's when power quietly changes hands. After alternatives become credible enough to function in select corridors, the system enters a new phase. The weapon remains potent, but its marginal return declines. This is not because targets become immune. It is because preparation becomes rational for everyone who watches. The sanctioning side's leverage depends on surprise, centralization, and the expectation that exclusion is catastrophic. Once those assumptions weaken, exclusion still imposes costs, but it no longer guarantees compliance or political outcomes. That is what the weapon loses power looks like in practice. Not the disappearance of the tool, but the erosion of its ability to scale as a decisive instrument. Durability is the key variable. A short-lived restriction can be interpreted as an emergency measure tied to a specific crisis. A long-lived restriction, especially one formalized to avoid repeated renewal debates, changes the system's baseline assumptions. The late 2025 European move to freeze a large stock of Russian central bank assets held in Europe, often discussed around €210 billion indefinitely, is a signal of that durability. The point is not the headline number alone. It is the institutional message. Under certain geopolitical conditions, safe assets can become legally inert for years, and policy can be engineered to outlast normal political cycles. Once that message is internalized, it reshapes behavior far beyond the original target. The behavioral response shows up first in operational planning. Banks and corporates begin treating payment routing as a resilience problem. Settlement instructions that were once optimized for speed and cost are rewritten to include contingency paths. Counterparties that once insisted on a single currency or single settlement venue become more willing to accept a menu, because insisting on exclusivity increases the risk of disruption. Firms do not need to make ideological statements to do this. They only need to justify it as operational continuity. And because global trade is repetitive energy shipments, industrial inputs, food commodities, small rule changes in contracts can aggregate into meaningful shifts in how flows are routed and where custody is held. This is the fragmentation tax phase. Multi-rail finance is less efficient than a single dominant rail. It usually means more foreign exchange conversions, more intermediaries, less netting efficiency, and higher compliance overhead. It can also mean a more complex legal map because the enforceability of claims depends on where they are booked and which courts govern disputes. Those costs are real, and they are why the legacy system remains attractive for most actors most of the time. But the tax is paid because single rail dependence now carries a different cost, a jurisdictional risk premium. In a world where access and custody are understood to be contingent, paying a few basis points more in transaction friction can look cheap compared to the tail risk of being unable to settle a critical import or access a reserve asset at the moment it matters. The system's second response is portfolio design. Reserve managers are conservative, so they do not dump the dollar on cue. The composition data supports that restraint. The dollar's share of disclosed global reserves remains in the high 50 seconds, and quarter-to-quarter moves are small relative to the headline narratives. That is consistent with a world where the dollar still offers unmatched liquidity, depth, and convenience. Yet the insurance layer continues to build. Central bank net purchases of gold, 1,045 tons in 2024, fit the logic of durability and jurisdictional risk. Gold does not need a foreign rail to be valuable, and it does not sit inside another state's legal system in the same way a custodial claim does. The point is not to replace the dollar with gold. It is to reduce exposure to a category of risk that the system has just demonstrated can be activated and can persist. A third response is expectations management. Once a nuclear option has been used, the strategic surprise is gone. Future targets assume it is possible and plan accordingly. Neutral actors assume that if geopolitical conflict rises, finance will not remain insulated, and they begin designing around that possibility. Even within the sanctioning coalition, Institutions have to weigh second-order effects. Will repeated use encourage more actors to build around the system, increasing fragmentation and reducing the future effectiveness of the tool? This is the paradox of coercive finance. The mechanism that delivers leverage in the short term can degrade the foundations of leverage in the long term because it teaches the rest of the network how to reduce dependence on the choke point. None of this implies that the core system disappears. In the real world, the legacy rails remain massive and attractive because they are efficient and liquid. The currency at the center retains its role because alternatives are still narrower in depth and because the existing order is embedded in everything from invoicing conventions to collateral practices. The shift is in the marginal decision-making that accumulates over time. A supply chain that can settle in 2 or 3 currencies is harder to coerce than one that can settle in only one. A central bank with diversified custody arrangements and a modest but meaningful insurance buffer is harder to pressure than one that concentrates all claims in a single jurisdiction. A banking system that has tested rerouting options can absorb a shock that would previously have been fatal. That is why the long-run effect of weaponization is not best measured by whether the target collapses. It is measured by whether the rest of the system starts acting as if it might be next. If it does, the weapon's power declines not because it stops working, but because it stops being uniquely decisive. It becomes one instrument among many in a world that has learned to root around extremes, and a world that roots around extremes is a world where leverage disperses. If the dollar is dead, story is wrong, but the monopoly is eroding, story is right, what does the new normal look like? The loop closes with a pattern and a dashboard. How to track the shift without hype. Reserve currencies don't usually die in a single crisis. They lose their monopoly the way empires lose their edge, by teaching the world how to live without them. By late 2025, the most defensible conclusion is neither triumphalist nor apocalyptic. The dollar remains central because the system around it is still the deepest pool of liquidity, the widest set of counterparties, and the most familiar legal operational stack. Yet the era of effortless exclusivity has been weakened by a demonstrated reality. Access to infrastructure and the usability of assets can be made contingent. Once that happens, rational actors don't need to abandon the core system to change it. They only need to add options. This is how power shifts in finance. Not by one dramatic vote, but by millions of small routing decisions that accumulate into a new equilibrium. The system begins to behave as if geopolitical stress is a baseline variable, not an exception. In that world, resilience becomes a design constraint. Firms widen settlement clauses. Banks broaden correspondent networks. Reserve managers diversify custody and add insurance assets. None of these moves require public declarations. They show up as quiet operational choices. But together, they create a structural effect. Coercive leverage becomes harder to scale, because targets and bystanders can increasingly choose less optimal but workable routes instead of facing catastrophic isolation. A short historical anchor helps keep expectations realistic. Reserve systems rarely flip because of a single event. They evolve through cumulative changes in trust, liquidity, and institutions. The shift from sterling-centered finance toward dollar-centered finance was not a clean switch, and it was driven as much by institutional redesign and credibility as by raw economic size. The modern world compresses timelines in technology and coordination, but it does not repeal the fundamental constraint. A currency's dominance is anchored in depth, legal predictability, and habitual use, while its monopoly erodes when the rest of the system learns to live with alternatives. The core pattern can be stated without dates or slogans. A dominant infrastructure gains power because it is universal. That universality invites weaponization when political incentives sharpen. Weaponization teaches everyone else where the choke points are. Once those choke points are visible, hedging becomes rational even for actors who prefer the legacy system. Hedging creates parallel rails and parallel custody strategies. Parallelism reduces monopoly power, not by destroying the core system, but by reducing the number of actors for whom exclusion is fatal. The practical question is how to track that shift without hype. A disciplined dashboard separates slow structural drift from fast activity signals, and both from capability building. It can be monitored with a small set of indicators, each telling a different story. Reserve composition as a slow layer. The dollar's share in disclosed official reserves. Read alongside the allocated versus unallocated split to avoid false certainty. Insurance behavior as a risk layer. Central bank net gold purchases and changes in gold's share of reserves, treated as a hedge against legal custody risk, rather than a substitute for liquidity. Payments activity as a fast layer. Currency shares and cross-border payments by value, watched for corridor-driven momentum rather than interpreted as immediate replacement. Alternative rail footprint as a capability layer. Coverage and participation metrics in non-legacy settlement and messaging pathways, tracked over time for durability rather than one-off spikes. Settlement technology maturation as an option layer. Programs moving from pilot to MVP to limited real value use, assessed for where they reduce dependence and where they still rely on legacy liquidity. Legal permanence as a precedent layer, whether immobilization and access restrictions remain exceptional or become standing architecture because durability changes incentives more than severity. Read together, these indicators do not point to an on-off outcome. They point to a world that is becoming more fragmented by design, because fragmentation is the price of optionality. The costs are real: more friction, more compliance complexity, more conversion steps, but so are the benefits: more strategic autonomy for those who can route across systems, and less decisive coercive power for those who once relied on universal choke points. This is the new normal: a core system that remains dominant in scale, surrounded by growing layers of redundancy that change bargaining power at the margin, and over time, the margin is where the map gets redrawn. The coming decade won't be a single regime change, it will be a series of smaller routing decisions that accumulate into a new equilibrium. The question isn't whether the system will fragment, it's who learns to navigate fragmentation first. What began as a surgical use of financial infrastructure has matured into a structural reality. Once the world sees that access and custody can be made contingent, it quietly starts paying for redundancy, even when the old system still works. History shows that when a dominant financial order weaponizes its choke points, it doesn't just punish adversaries. It incentivizes rivals and neutrals to build alternatives, eroding the monopoly that made the weapon effective, much as Sterling's era gave way when trust and institutions shifted under geopolitical strain. The practical takeaway is to track the trend, not the headlines. Optionality grows first in routing choices, custody decisions, and insurance assets long before any dramatic reserve reset appears. If you want to apply this, start by stress testing your own exposure currency concentration, custody jurisdiction, and the indicators that signal fragmentation, then follow the next analyses as we turn that dashboard into actionable scenarios. Memorable rule: the more a system relies on financial dominance as a weapon, the faster it teaches the world how to live without it.